Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Wednesday night. I'm going to bring in a frequent guest, Amy Koch Frederickson. She has been on this show many times as our Republican political analyst. Tonight, things take a little bit more of a turn for a somber conversation because, yes, we're going to talk about politics, but we're going to do so as it relates to the shooting of Alex Preddy by Border Patrol agents in the city of Minneapolis this past weekend. Hi, Amy.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jana.
Appreciate your time. So, Amy, the reason I wanted to have the conversation with you is that we have seen not a large, but somewhat of a shift in tone by some Republican office holders after the shooting of Alex Preddy. In your political opinion, why do you think that's happening?
Well, and it should have happened, by the way, after the shooting of Renee Good. And I think that sometimes it just becomes difficult for people on either side of the aisle to sort of break with what their party is saying. You did see a few people speaking out, but it really got louder over the weekend after the shooting of Alex. So I talk about those. Obviously, both of those shootings, for me, they're of course they're one and the same, right? There is no difference. And after Renee was shot, I said any law enforcement operation where the use of deadly force was employed would pause what they were doing, investigate what happened, and know that something is wrong with your operation when that happens, right? And that didn't happen. In fact, the folks in charge made some really loud statements and really harsh statements about domestic terrorists and all of those things, instead of what they should have done, which is stop, investigate, and determine what went wrong. And that is where, and we can talk about all the other things too, right? The both sides leaders kept political rhetoric at an all-time high. It was not helpful. But I just want to talk about like the operation itself, which was clearly having an issue. And so when it happens again, which it neither should have ever happened, they were both completely avoidable. But when it happens again, I just think that, thank goodness, folks from both sides said, this is out of control. We need to stop. We need to get a handle. We need to, no one, even everyone's rhetoric it just became just like this horror. 2 Minnesotans are dead. And there is nothing right or political or good about that. There's just 2 Minnesotans dead.
I agree with you. I want to read what Republican Representative Nolan West told the Star Tribune. He said, "It is clear that Operation Metro Surge is causing more harm than good. It puts law enforcement officers' lives at risk, and it feeds the chaos destroying our state." Senate Republican Bill Cassidy on X, he is from Louisiana, said, "The events in Minneapolis are incredibly disturbing. The credibility of ICE and DHS are at stake. There must be a full joint federal and state investigation. We can trust the American people with the truth."
That's right.
I'm not reading a lot of statements. What's that?
Yeah, could I point out, I want to point out, Representative Marion Rarick.
Yes.
From Wright County.
Yes.
I want to call her out because she spoke out the week before.
Yes.
Alex was killed.
Yes.
And said that this was, called out the operation, right? And I want to point that out because, of course, it starts to be more and more voices, and that's good. There should have been more voices. But when you're alone out there, I want to point that out. I think about, there were some folks, even the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, which is a real Second Amendment group.
Yes.
Rob Dorr, after Renee Good, was talking about, about the use of deadly force and when it is justified and when it isn't. And making some statements that he was taking a lot of heat from the right side. And still he spoke out. So I just want to point out that there were voices, there weren't enough voices. And And I want to acknowledge them.
I'm glad that you brought up Representative Rarick. I actually spoke with her on the phone. She wasn't feeling well, so we didn't do an interview. Shortly after, she posted on her Facebook page, Representative Rarick is a Republican, and you point out, the courage, especially in the current iteration of the Republican Party, to go on your own. She was doing it when other Republicans weren't, and she told me on the phone that she swore an oath to the Constitution, not a party.
That's
and
right.
To call what's right, and what's wrong. And she was saying that Operation Metro Surge had gone too far. And again, that was prior to Alex Preddy's killing.
Yes. Very important, I think, to point that out, because it was obvious, right? And that is not to say I am not, I'm not a no ICE person. I'm not an ICE out. I don't think that's realistic. It was like how I felt about defund the police. I get it. It's a tagline, but it doesn't make any sense. ICE was in Minnesota and is in other states doing immigration enforcement, and they should be everywhere, right? That is just, in my opinion, that is that. But what I saw with 2,000 to 3,000 agents that I think that had seemingly had no organization, no leadership, and were told by very high-placed individuals they could do whatever they wanted and they would not be held accountable. Any American should recognize that constitutionally, that is what we fought, at least a couple wars over, not happening. And it shouldn't be so hard for us to stand up and say once again when that's not acceptable, no matter who's in charge, right? Just no matter who's in charge.
Right. No secret that the Trump administration, President Trump, ran on being tough and hard on immigration. And people voted for that. The people that voted for him said, yes, we agree with you. Yes, go do that. But what we've seen in other cities, but we can only speak, really intimately about what we know in our city and our community, and what we've seen is that a line was crossed for a lot of people. Even before 2 people were killed, that these were going too far, that this isn't actually the kind of immigration enforcement they thought they were signing up for. They thought they were signing up for, let's get the worst of the worst and let's do better on immigration than perhaps our predecessors did. And then people got to see so many videos because everyone has a cell phone, and there is a healthy population of what they call ICE and Border Patrol observers showing how this is going down. And I think that isn't sitting well. And some Republicans are saying, I don't like this.
Right. And, can I recognize that not only is ICE have a role to play, right? But can I also recognize that on the left, some hyped the rhetoric, right? Can I also recognize that there were folks that weren't from Minnesota in the crowd? So sometimes when you get mobs like that, and we've seen this before in Minnesota, you get folks that are just there to sort of ramp up and sow chaos. I can recognize that. I can recognize all of those things. And I can also say that the operation was not well planned. It was not well led. I hope that some folks are being held accountable. Somebody said to me, well, the president is not going to fire Kristi Noem, but he's moved Bovino, but he's going to hold on to Kristi Noem. And I'm not even holding her entirely responsible for this, right? But someone who is in charge, someone was calling the shots. And I kind of miss Apprentice Trump, who used to say, when you did a bad job, you had to be held responsible for that. Otherwise, everyone will do a bad job. And this needs to be looked at in so many ways. 2 people died. There has been, and aside from that, there has been damage to cities. There's been economic damage when you're looking at the numbers, right? Like there's been a destabilized trust in all law enforcement across the state, and the whole state is in mourning. And somebody that needs to be, all the costs have to be considered in this, and folks have to be held accountable. Why wouldn't we want that? Who wouldn't want that?
So when it comes to politicians coming out, and I'm not going to single anyone out because that's not the point here, when you have some Republicans saying enough is enough, this has gone too far, from Rand Paul to Tom Tillis to Julia Coleman to Representative West, the others I've mentioned, and then you have this crescendo with Chris Mattel dropping out of the Republican governor's race when he was starting to get some momentum, saying, I just cannot be a part of this. It's a signal to the party, in addition to the polling. I know politicians look at polling, and the polling, I would guess, it was already getting pretty dire, and after the killing of Mr. Preddy, probably is going to be even worse, with what Americans saying, I don't like the way this is going.
Right. I've heard several polls. I don't want to quote them there. You can look them up. There's a few very credible polls that show, Republicans' strength with independents from July, where Republicans were actually a +2, going well, right? Again, there was support for getting the bad guys and immigration enforcement, right? There was support. It's not me blaming. I'm saying the Biden administration, by their own numbers, said that illegal border crossings from the day of the Biden inauguration were unmanageable by their own estimates, about 2,500 a day. That's where they were at for almost the entirety of his presidency. So people voted on that. Was one of the issues that definitely Republicans and Trump had a lead on. And then you saw it dwindle to where now we're at a Dem +5. The last numbers I heard were more than double digits, like deeply with independents, Democrats plus, multiple double digits. That's also not a reason just to speak out. It is a result of what happened. We are still a very long way to the election. Boy, I tell you what, I mean, just again, a few months ago, I would have told you Republicans, and I think I said on here,
You did.
Republicans are going to do well in this election. And so I'm not even saying like right now, we don't know, it's always a snapshot. But there's definitely been a political fallout on this as well.
Why don't we see more Republicans, especially in those running for governor? Obviously, Mr. Mattel excluded now because he dropped out, giving this very specific reason. And Chris Mattel is someone who is close with law enforcement, represents many police officers. And he said what we heard law enforcement leaders say over a week ago, that this operation is making our police officers' jobs less safe.
Right.
Why aren't we seeing more people running for governor or in our congressional delegation on the Republican side say enough is enough? We need to, at minimum, pause this for 60 days and reassess.
Well, so, perhaps for some, it's not as close or as personal, right? It's not as close up, just geographically, right? Maybe some people live in an area where they were not impacted by this. But let me tell you, a lot of Minnesota was. It wasn't just Minneapolis, St. Paul, all the surrounding areas, of course. But even beyond that, we heard stories from Wilmer. We heard stories from St. Cloud. We heard stories from, southern Minnesota and Rochester and throughout the state. We heard impact stories. I heard things going on in Buffalo, Minnesota. And so it's certainly not that, but that is in part, right? If it's not impacting you or not in your face, it's a little easier to toe a party line. I also think there's just something to people have become so siloed in their media that in a way you can watch if you're staying with your national news and you're just watching MS Now or you're just watching Fox News or whatever, you can have two very different feelings about the same story. And that's not a cop out. And then third, it's just hard for people to in this hyper partisan era to step outside, take their red jersey off or their blue jersey off and call a ball and a strike because you're held up as, a traitor to either one. We've become very almost religious about our political beliefs. And we have to get back to the place where we are devoted first and foremost to our families and our community and our churches and our country, and then to our political party. And that sounds big and maybe optim, but that is really and truly what it is. We are Americans. We're Minnesotans first. and speaking out, no matter who's in charge about something that's wrong, it's unfortunate, but it has become really difficult. And this is not the same comparison, but in a way, right? President Biden stayed in the race so long. Yeah. And there were so many Democrats that just refused to acknowledge what was like right in front of your face. It can be what everyone sees. And in fact, they'll turn on someone in their own party that dares to speak out. And so then you're just sort of left alone. You're just sort of sitting there. I mean, there are people that will, and you're really alone, because if your own party has turned on you, the other party is so hyper partisan that they're gonna bang on you too. They're gonna be, oh, well, you're just saying that is too, you're too little, too late, or whatever. You're not accepted. Now you're not only not accepted by your own party, but you're never going to be accepted by the other side. So you're really just out there on your own. And that is human nature for that to be, we are tribal people, and it's hard to be out there on your own.
Sort of a sad commentary on politics, and that could be true in both parties, but certainly an observation we're thinking about, like the enormity of career risk a person takes just to say the right thing, no matter what it is.
That's it. I mean, it's more of a rare individual to do that. And there has to be other people that believe the same that then step in very quickly, right? And so, but I don't know how else to say it. Like it seems so simple. It seems so obvious. And yet we are in a place in American politics where it's just becoming much more rare. It's just rarefied air now to just speak up when something is just wrong. And it often means your career, right? Like so very often now it's cancel culture from the other side, but it's cancel culture within your own ranks too.
Yeah.
And
Look at the
I
fall
always
of
think
Marjorie
that,
Taylor Greene.
Yeah. What happened to her? She's gone. She's gone. She dared to say, this. And was there anyone more MAGA than Marjorie Taylor Greene? I can't think of a single state or congressperson that was more than her. And with one little disagreement, she's out. And not just out, but a traitor. It's just, what's happening here, folks? Like, really, and there's nothing to do but start with yourself and realize there's nothing to do when it comes to this sort of thing except start with yourself and realize that it's the world. Politics have become partisan, but right and wrong haven't changed. And you keep that like as your North Star, and you're gonna do okay. But you might not be an elected official. And we also have to get to a point where we're starting to recognize that they are humans and that there is varying people along the spectrum in all partisan places, and people start just voting that way instead of just watching the right or the left news and banging on people on the other side mindlessly.
Well, maybe we are at the precipice of change. I don't know, but there's always hope.
I keep being hopeful. I think what else could happen that would illustrate it so clearly? It should be, and I think it can be, but it's going to take a lot of people. Everybody's got to kind of start right inside them.
Amy Cope Fredrickson, thanks for being with us on The Plus. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate you, and I'm glad to see you and seeing you looking well. So thanks for what you do.
Appreciate you. That's all for us on The Plus on this Wednesday night. Take care.